Hey everybody, welcome back. Thank you so much for supporting this work. If you're supporting on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, like button, all the usual features. If you're watching on the Patreon, you're already supporting. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Could not do any of this work without you guys. Please consider it. If you're not a patron, go to patreon.com/Eric Draitser, $5 a month. Full access to all content, all the kind of videos you see on YouTube, plus a lot more. Please go over there and support this work. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Ethiopia right now. Ethiopia seems to be on the brink of civil war, if it's not already considered a civil war. We need to understand it from a geopolitical perspective, from a strategic perspective, but also from a human perspective. So let's try to discuss that. And I'm working very hard to stay focused on the camera and not focus on notes or anything like that. So I'm going to keep looking straight ahead and we'll see how this works. So, if you had read about it in the news, then you probably know at least the vague outlines of what's going on in Ethiopia. Specifically, the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has launched a military campaign against the northern region of Tigray, which is led by the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, and that group is basically now engaged in a full military conflict with the central government in Addis Ababa. Now, we do have to understand some of the history in order to really understand the significance of this and how this is all playing out, because, of course, the history of this is deeply tied to the ethnic divisions. It's deeply tied to regional dynamics and regional history that has to be understood. So I'm going to try to run through that in a very, very limited amount of time and give you sort of a crash course on that to bring us up to speed to today. So, basically, over decades, Ethiopia was, at least since the end of the rule by the Derg and the establishment of what we would call, I guess you could say, the current Ethiopian federal state, was for a long time ruled by members of the Tigray, that is the ethnic group coming from the north of the country. The Tigrayan people, the TPLF, had been in control of the Ethiopian government really up until the ascension of Prime Minister Abiy a couple of years ago. And when that happened, that was a monumental shift in Ethiopian politics, because Abiy comes from the majority Oromo ethnic group rather than the minority Tigray ethnic groups. So this was a move towards the sort of majoritarian, at least from an ethnic perspective, majoritarian control over the Ethiopian government. Needless to say, the leadership in Tigray was none too happy with this. They had long been accustomed to controlling the country, being in a dominant position politically, and so naturally there have been tensions and strife between Addis Ababa and the people in the leadership, I should say, in the Tigrayan region. Now, just to sort of center your focus and try to get your maps in order, Tigray is in the north, but this borders both Eritrea and Sudan, right? So now, if you know something about the Horn of Africa, then you know the long and bloody history between Eritrea and Ethiopia, a long war that really just recently was officially concluded, but even that is sort of suspect. Let's remember that Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy won the Nobel Peace Prize just a couple of years ago over his brokering of the peace deal with the Eritrean state, with Isaias Afwerki and the Eritrean government, effectively ending that war. So Abiy is not exactly a rookie when it comes to sort of international diplomacy, but this is something different. And we do need to understand the dynamics at play that brought us to this point. And then maybe I can kind of circle back to some of the other regional issues. So once Abiy comes to power, there is this sort of transition, as I said, away from this minority rule, and a lot of developments in terms of, quote unquote, liberalization or reforms are made, including the release of political prisoners, including a number of sort of reconciliatory, or I should say reconciliation or conciliatory gestures on the part of the Ethiopian state. That seems to be now kind of shifting away from those moves and back towards a more aggressive posture vis-a-vis the people of the people of Tigray and the TPLF. So we have to sort of keep in mind here that as Abiy has kind of addressed the issue of Tigray, he has found himself embroiled in a number of different conflicts. So let's just kind of talk a little bit about how this happened. Essentially, and again, I am highly oversimplifying here, but essentially, there was to be an election that was supposed to be held throughout Ethiopia, and that was postponed, at least ostensibly due to coronavirus, right? So, COVID has hit Ethiopia pretty hard. Ethiopia was already facing a number of other issues, including various conflicts, including locusts and other really significant problems that were hampering agricultural output, that were hampering business, that were hampering a number of different things. So this comes in the midst of an already tense time for Ethiopia. So the prime minister essentially delays the elections for a year, says the elections will not be held as promised, and that this is more or less due to COVID and the inability to hold an election and so forth. I'm not going to speculate as to whether or not that's legit, whether or not that's just kind of a ploy being used to kind of play for time and consolidate power. You know, I think probably a safe argument can be made either way. But ultimately, the election was postponed. Now, what happens next is rather interesting because the Tigray region and I guess I should sort of clarify. Tigray is somewhat autonomous. It's like a semi-autonomously controlled region. Remember that Ethiopia is, a federated state. This is not one solid, single state, but rather a collection of states. So the Tigray region in the north, which is essentially semi-autonomous, decided to go against Abiy's order, basically, and hold an election, a regional election. Now, the interplay, and this is important, the interplay between the federal government, the central government in Addis Ababa, the regional governments in the states, and the local governments at the local level, that is one of the crucial issues to understand in Ethiopia because it's pretty complicated. While it's a federated state, the individual regional states have tremendous authority locally, but then the local governments also have authority. So, in the United States and elsewhere, we would be somewhat familiar with that setup, but in Ethiopia, it's a little bit even more complicated, the sort of relationship between the central government and those of the states, the regions. So anyway, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but basically the Tigray held their election. The election was considered illegitimate by the government in Ethiopia, and that then kicked off this new phase of the crisis, because what happens next is, depending on who you ask, the TPLF denies this, but this is what the central government says, that the TPLF forces essentially attacked a military base for the purposes of stealing the equipment. So some heavy weapons and others that had been stolen from an Ethiopian military base, allegedly by these fighters, that then forces Prime Minister Abiy to essentially militarize this conflict and to send in the military forces, because he sort of considers this an attack on the Ethiopian state. Without making too many comments on that, I think we can understand any government suggesting that when its military is attacked, that the country itself is under attack. So you can see the scale, the significance of what's happened here. Now, this is now where we are at in the conflict, where the Ethiopian military has gone into Tigray and are now essentially doing, trying to assert control over the region. Now, we have to also keep in mind, though, that this is not some, immovable object coming to Tigray that is just going to step on the neck of the TPLF. The TPLF has a long history of military, engagement. Many of Ethiopia's Ethiopia's top generals and top fighters come from Tigray. Many of the special forces come from Tigray. So there is a real issue here because there is a question of loyalty. There's a question of the military splitting along ethnic lines. Are those Tigray forces inside of the Ethiopian military? Are they going to attack their own people? Are they going to lay down their weapons? Are they going to create conflict inside the military structure? I think that is certainly something that Abiy and the forces of the central government in Ethiopia are concerned about. I think it certainly remains to be seen. So the situation is getting worse and worse. This is now becoming a humanitarian catastrophe. We now have a report from Amnesty International that scores, if not hundreds, of people were massacred in a village somewhere in the western portion. I think it's in the western portion of Tigray, and depending on what the well, we don't know exactly because there are no observers that are allowed inside the war zone at this point. Telecommunications are cut, the internet, phones, everything is cut, so it's unclear what's happening there. But what does seem to be clear is that a massacre has taken place. Scores, if not hundreds, were massacred not by bullets but hacked to death with blades. Now, think about the viciousness and brutality that is required to carry out that kind of an atrocity. I mean, this is something that happens all over the world, and it's happened historically, so it's not some kind of aberration. But when you close your eyes and really try to picture what hundreds of people being hacked to death looks like, I think you're starting to get a sense of the danger of the violence of this kind of a conflict in Ethiopia, especially a country that has a history as Ethiopia does. So that's the stage that we're at now, and so we have to sort of keep in mind this human cost of all of this. Now, at the same time, though, as we sort of get into the details of this conflict, we have to pull back, and this is kind of what hopefully what you're here for, from me at least, pull back to understand the geopolitical and strategic significance of all of this, because the Horn of Africa is critically important. Ethiopia is critically important. It is important for Africa. It is important in the global struggle between the United States and China. It is important in so many ways. So let's talk a little bit about some of the regional dynamics and what's going on. And before we can do that, we have to know who are the key players here. Who are the key players and what are the key issues? Well, one of the key issues with regard to Ethiopia and why this conflict with Tigray is so significant has to do with Ethiopia's construction of one of the world's most important dam projects. That specifically is the GERD, the GERD, or the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, this dam on the Blue Nile, which is one of the primary I don't know if that's technically a tributary, but one of the primary branches of the Nile River, the source of the Nile's water, the Ethiopians are building a massive dam there. Now, the dam is supposed to, of course, insulate and secure the water security for Ethiopia and electricity generation. It is considered vital for Ethiopia's economic development, and it is considered one of the sort of cornerstones of African economic development and Ethiopian economic development specifically. The Chinese technicians, Chinese investment, and so forth, that was heavily involved as well. But this isn't a Chinese project per se. It is an Ethiopian project, but the Chinese are very heavily invested in Ethiopia, as are many others. Ethiopia is a massive country, millions of people, massive market. Telecommunications is huge in Ethiopia. Telecommunications as a sort of a target for global corporations looking at Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in many ways a very dynamic economy, considered, the UN considered it a miracle economy. Okay, so now the dam is central to the economic plans here. So The dam is deeply problematic, though. It is problematic on a regional level because the dam raises very serious questions from both Sudan and especially Egypt about their water security, because those countries depend on the Nile for their very existence. And without that flow of water, or rather, with Ethiopia being able to control the flow of water in the Nile, the Egyptians are concerned, of course, as you might imagine, that they will essentially be at the mercy of Ethiopia, and they will be more or less tied to Ethiopia in terms of their own policy and in terms of their own planning and agriculture and all of the rest of that. So and similarly for Sudan, the same issues apply, though Sudan is of course less in terms of population than Egypt and less significant in terms of global geopolitics than Egypt is, obviously. So um, the dam project is really critical to understand, because it is the dam where you see this sort of tension between the United States and China. China has been supportive of Ethiopia, supportive of the dam project, supportive of regional players that have also gotten involved, but at the same time the Chinese maintain close relations with both Egypt and especially with Sudan. So you can see that the Chinese find themselves in a complicated position with respect to the dam. At the same time, the United States is absolutely opposing, at least under Trump, opposing the dam and siding with Egypt. As you might imagine, the Trump administration loving to get into bed with the Saudis and with Egypt at any time. So that is one of the major issues here. The other critical one to look at, and again, you want to refer to your map here. Take a look at your geography. Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, located as it is on the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. That is the strait that separates the Horn of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula, entrance into the Red Sea, one of the most critical choke points in the world as far as commercial shipping, as far as other commercial interests, but also military and strategic ones. The Bab al-Mandeb is critical for China. It is access to the Red Sea, which means access to the Suez Canal, which means access to the Mediterranean Sea and Europe, broadly speaking. So now, if you look at the map and you look at what's really happening in the Horn of Africa, if Ethiopia slips into civil war, you now have the entire Horn of Africa essentially at war, at the same time that you have a 5-year war raging on the other side of the Bab al-Mandeb in Yemen, tearing that country apart as well. So you can see that the entire region is essentially at war in this scenario. Now, that means the Chinese are going to have a very difficult time getting their goods to market, because despite their best intentions, the new Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road, all of that in terms of shipping, that's not here yet. The Chinese are still very much dependent upon commercial shipping via maritime shipping routes, and so the instability in the Horn of Africa and in the Bab al-Mandeb could be really critical for the Chinese and for Chinese economic development, particularly at this time as China is desperate to try to recapture the dynamism of its economic growth from previous years, prior to COVID and prior to the trade war and the rest of that. So, and now we also have to keep in mind too how Ethiopia would play into a potential Biden administration, because assuming that what we think we know about who's going to be in the Biden administration is true, we could potentially see the United States shift once again with respect to Ethiopia, and unlike the Trump administration, become a little bit more open to dealing with the Ethiopians in a way that would be, let's say, more confrontational. And what I mean by that is the United States a little more openly siding with Tigray in this conflict. And the reason I say that is because, well, primarily because of who we think will be involved in the Biden administration, specifically Susan Rice. I think Susan Rice is probably the most important figure to know. Assuming Susan Rice becomes either Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, or something along those lines, Susan Rice has a long history in Africa. She is one of the, quote unquote experts on Africa, engaged there for years. She basically was mentored into the foreign service, I guess you could say, through Africa policy. She has a long and close, or had a long and close relationship with Meles Zenawi, the former dictator of Ethiopia. I'm not even going to touch any of the rumors about Susan Rice and her personal issues with respect to Ethiopia. But the point is, she attended the funeral, if I recall correctly, the funeral of the former dictator Zenawi, and she was considered close to them. So, what does that mean? I think that means that Susan Rice has deep ties, long-standing ties to the elites of the Tigray, and not necessarily the inroads with Abiy and Oromo people. So then the question is, would the United States come in and essentially, I don't want to say necessarily side with Tigray, but use the conflict to say, okay, ceasefire, no operations. Tigray maintains its independence. Nobody has to, see prison for treason or anything like this, right? A freezing of the conflict well, the creation of a frozen conflict, really. I think that that's a real possibility. Susan Rice has shown in the past that her loyalty in this way figures really centrally. I mean, she certainly throughout her time in the Obama administration absolutely played favorites and absolutely demonstrated that sort of lack of equanimity in terms of her policy. So anyway, a Biden administration is likely going to inflame what's going on in Ethiopia, and also drive the Ethiopians closer to China potentially. Or maybe another way of looking at that is trying to pry the Ethiopians away from China, but also potentially driving them into the arms of the Chinese. Very, very interesting times. Ethiopia is the one of the hubs in Africa. It is the heart of the African Union. It is the location of its headquarters. It is critical in so many ways. And so as we watch Ethiopia potentially slipping into civil war, we have to really get nervous about the fate of the Horn of Africa. That means the situation with Eritrea as well. That means the ongoing conflict with Ethiopia and Eritrea in terms of the border situation and occupation forces. It means the situation in Sudan, both with northern Sudan and the refugees flooding out of Tigray and into Sudan, but also with South Sudan as well, which is teetering on the brink. And I have another video talking about how South Sudan is teetering on the brink of collapse. So major instability in the Horn of Africa could affect all of Africa and really the entire world when it comes down to it. So let's keep an eye on it. Go to the Patreon page, learn about these issues, try to get the background and understand them so that when you read the news, you really have a sense of what's actually happening under the surface there. Patreon.com/Eric Draitser. Subscribe on the YouTube. Follow me there as well. More videos coming soon. So much to talk about, so little time. See you soon.